All right, in this section of the PowerPoint, we are going to talk about the economy, so key concept 2.3, and then if we get to it, the cultural, key concept 2.1 in Rome. The use of lead, you might notice on the periodic table, a symbol for lead actually comes from the Roman word for lead. The Romans used lead a lot, even though they knew it was bad for them. They used it in their pipes and aqueducts. They used it in their homes. They used it for their dishes. It was used by elite, not everyone. And it's kind of interesting that they used it even though it was bad for them. The malleability made it very, very popular. But hopefully we'll get a little bit more into that in class. Okay, so the economy in Rome. The economy in Rome was pretty amazing. Rome itself was really the city of cities. It had tons of money coming in, both from trade, from tributes, from conquests. I mean, Rome was where it's at, but there were many cities like Rome in the Roman Empire because of the way they organized their trade. So, first of all, they spent a lot of money on infrastructure, and this again is key concept 2.3. The Mare Nostrum, or the Mediterranean Sea, and the roads, were systems and infrastructure put in place by the Romans. So they made sure that people had protection. They made sure that they taxed trade so that they had really great infrastructure in port cities and along roads. They also specialized by region, and then they integrated those regions. And this is allowed for specialization of different products. So they were made better by the people. So they figured out new technologies to create, better, for example, wine, or to really enhance their output of grain, um, stuff like that. And all of these different regions work together, and you'll see that in the maps in a second. Cities like Rome were really the backbone of the economy, and they also were centers of integration, government, religious, and cultural areas. And we'll see that as well in a couple of pictures. But that meant that rural and urban areas were very different. Cities offered a lot of different entertainment and culture, whereas rural areas maintained a lot of their previous character religiously and economically, except for they now had these big, huge plantations. Um, and by the way, these cities like London, Paris, Lyon, Budapest, and Barcelona, they were all created by the Romans at first as military outposts, right? So you, when you look at Western Europe, you really see the dawning of urbanism and then the fall of urbanism with the Roman Empire. So this is Trajan's Roman Empire here. I love Trajan. He's like super fascinating. If you ever take a classics class, make sure you learn about him. And these guys are going to come into play in a little bit. Here you can see the specialization that I was talking about in the previous slide. These are the different things that the Romans were getting from different areas. And you can see that the rivers are shown on this map. That's because rivers were a very important way to move goods around. They the rivers, especially in places like France and Italy, there are actually areas where there are where there were ports, where there are tons of artifacts that people are still digging out of rivers within what was the Roman Empire. Byzantium, we're going to take a look at that in a little bit. Um, all the places where there's kind of a center of entertainment, you can see have these little coliseums, but just look at these different products that come from all over the place. Exotic animals, those were often used in festivals. We'll get to that in a second. Slaughtering hundreds of animals a day in these festivals. Oh, this is just interesting. If you want to take a gander, they were definitely spending more than they were making during certain times. Um, this shows the separation of empire, but I just want you to take a look again at the flow of materials and where they're coming from. So you can see breadbasket, 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 um, products that are used for the creation of goods going towards craftsmen. There are craftsmen, in Rome, and then also in what we're going to learn about in Byzantium. And then flow of government spending. So these are areas, a lot of the government spending is going towards building infrastructure, especially because on these edges you've got a lot of disgruntled people who invade the Roman Empire. Why no one here? This is the Sahara Desert. Okay, so economic effects of this. You got a lot of technology that was created. Like I said, their road systems were incredible. The aqueducts were also incredible and supplied water for both personal use and for entertainment in places like the baths, the public baths, and private baths in rich homes. You had mills that were used for entire cities and coliseums and entertainment and all that stuff. You had specialization, as I already mentioned, by region, and that created more goods and fostered more trade. But there was a yin to the yang. The inequality led to instability. There was a huge gap between rich versus poor, and this was made more prominent by the increasingly heavy use of slaves in the Roman Empire. Slaves came from outlying regions in the Roman Empire. And those slaves were used for work both in cities, in rural areas, and in festivals. And that also, there were lots of slave revolts because of that. And it stifled innovation because there was no need to innovate when you had this cheap form of labor in the later empire. Plus, you had this huge group of people who had to be distracted by their poverty. All of these poor or rural people who were put out of work by this cheap source of labor. So you distracted them with bread, free bread. That's where that kind of comes into play. You'll see that echoed later on in European administrations, and circuses. So you're talking about 80-day long festivals with tons and tons of shows, both for the rich and the poor, in places like the Colosseum to distract people from their poverty. And in this section of the PowerPoint, we're going to get into the cultural aspects of Rome. So this is key concept 2.1.